Welcome to Social Justice Leadership Training Program. I'm your moderator for today, Reagan, and I'm a sophomore in high school. This is our founder of Platform, Dr. Samantha Joo, and our guest speaker for today, Miss Lee. How are you guys doing today?
Good. How are you?
Good. We're gonna be talking about power versus influence and your opinions on it. So before we get into the topic, Miss Lee, what is your job position? Where do you work?
Are you asking me or are you asking Dr. Joo?
You.
Oh, okay. So I am based in Oakland, California, San Francisco Bay Area, and I am currently a consultant and coach for nonprofit organizations that are looking to work on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I am also a recovering executive director, so I have run a couple of different nonprofits and really decided to branch out a couple of years ago and focus on racial equity work because of the lack of diversity, inclusion, and belonging in the nonprofit sector as well as the philanthropic sector. Dr. Joo?
Oh, Reagan knows where I work. Do you, Reagan? You know where I work, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay. So, what we're gonna start off with? What's your definition of power?
That's for you, Jessica.
So, I think that power and influence are what you make of it. So, alone, those words aren't either positive or negative in terms of meaning. It's what you do with power and influence that matters, right? So, for example, there's a lot of different types of power. So there's like personal power, there's positional power, and we can spend a whole day just talking and examining different types of power. But ultimately, what that means is that you essentially have power in order to make an impact, in order to do something with, right? And so for me, I never liked the idea of having a positional power, which is essentially power that you hold given your job title, when I was an executive director. But I realized that with power came influence and that I can choose to use both for good. Um, so I think oftentimes when we think about power in the nonprofit sector or even in the corporate sector, it's a very top-down structure. And we look at it in terms of, okay, so people at the top of an organization hold more power, but that has really shifted, I would say, in the last couple of years, in terms of like what I think we, meaning like particularly young people and those who work on racial equity issues, define as power and as influence. What do you think, Dr. Joo?
I'm going to defer to Reagan and then come back to it because there's a lot you said, and I want to break it down a little bit. Reagan, what is your definition of power?
Of power is the capacity or like to directly influence the behavior of an individual or an event or outcome. But I agree with her that they're definitely very intertwined.
Well, I'm curious. I want to come down to this because Jessica, you and Miriam have this aversion almost to this top down model. And I'm trying to break it down because a lot of the places that I've worked at, the most conclusive, effective is when it is top down. And when one person makes a decision and make sure that is followed through. When it's more democratic, I find it to be slow and cumbersome. And so this is the one I want to sort of tackle because I wonder if top down can be influential, not positional in the sense that does top down always have to be positional, Jessica?
It depends on how you define it.
In other words, it gets results quicker if you have one person making decisions rather than a committee making a decision. And this is why I have difficulty sometimes when we have to agree upon things as a team.
So I think, Sam, that there's a component of leadership that we are missing from this conversation, right? So top down is more efficient, but people follow leaders, right? So it's not, so you can make a decision top down. Yes, that can be a very efficient, quick process, but if you want to implement it as a manager, are they going to actually implement it?
If you scare the crap out of them, yes.
Yeah, but then what, is that a good leader? And how long are they going to stay in the organization or the company, right? So I think it's looking at it from like, I think you're associating power with good leadership, or it's assuming good leadership, right? So
No,
like,
you could, like at the very beginning, I said you could be a good intended or bad intended leader, but you could still be as a bad or good intended, you could be effective. I've seen a lot of bad intended leaders who are extremely effective in their methods of getting their objective done. I've seen a lot of good intended leaders who, for the love of God, cannot get a single project done because they are always wanting to consider everyone's perspective, include their opinion, and make sure that everyone is happy before they get to the second step. And by that time, 2 years has passed by. And so what I'm talking about here is this. I think you could be influential from a top-down model.
Yes.
And that could be effective.
Yes.
And so the question now is this. It's not the top-down is problematic. It's the kind of power that we use in order to get work done.
To a certain extent, I agree with you.
I want you to why do you preface to a certain extent? Explain to me. Give me a situation.
So I'm thinking about movements, right? So I'm thinking about like widespread movements of change. And I'm also thinking about it from a racial equity perspective. So let's take a recent example. So you know Donald Trump, right? You know who he is? I'm assuming you know who he is, Sam?
He's not a president anymore, from what I understand.
Yeah, the guy who lost the election, right? So there was a movement that happened on TikTok. I don't know, Reagan, if you heard about this or if you participated. Do you know what TikTok is, Sam? I don't want to assume.
I know I'm old, but I ain't that old.
Okay. So there was a movement on TikTok where, you know, Donald Trump was out there rallying, you know, like wanting people to come to his rallies, and, you know, you had to like get a ticket or RSVP for it. And so there was a movement on TikTok by Gen Z to basically, they were like, forget everyone else. We like the baby boomers, Gen Xers, like they're not helping us, right? Like basically we are going to organize together. And what we're going to do is that we're going to RSVP to a bunch of his seats and not show up. There was not one leader, right? It was extremely influential. It was extremely effective in terms of impact. And it sent a message. You know, so I'm thinking about it from that perspective of like, when we're talking about social change, like look at the Black Lives Matter movement, right? The Women's March, the Civil Rights March, right? The March for Our Lives. Like, if you look at some of those perspectives, it's not one person making a decision and saying, we are going to do a march. It's like you combined groups of people as organizers.
Yeah, but there's an initiator. There's one who started the fire. So that person, technically you could say, is the person who is using social media as the beginning point, but we need to have the person to initiate it. So without the initiator, then you can't really have this mass movement. And also, even Black Lives Matter. In each city, you have singular organizations which organize, and those people who organize, you have a top-down model. So
That came
therefore, you
after.
can't completely eliminate the leader.
But that came after, right? That came after the protests and everything. And it's not always one initiator, it is sometimes a group of people. So that's the other thing to think about, right? Like it's not just, and I think that people who are not used to like you know, having multiple leaders or shared models, I think that there is something to be said about buying into this like top down, one person in power hierarchy that feels comfortable. I have noticed that with like the different generations that I worked with on racial equity work, like it's more comfortable when you know who's in charge, because it's scary to know there's a whole group of like tens of thousands of people out there who are making change and you don't know who the person, who like the one person is. And it's usually groups of people. It's not like one person. I mean, even like Alicia Garza was a co-founder. It wasn't like one person decided that Black Lives Matter and started a movement, right? It was a group, it was like three of them.
Yeah, I agree. Reagan, do you agree with Jessica? Because I know that I need to mull it over, because I like to disagree with her, because sometimes I don't like her. Reagan, you are muted again. The mic, can you play around with your mic again? Her mic goes on and off for some reason. I wonder if two models can coexist without it conflicting and creating tension.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
Okay.
Reagan.
Yes, I do agree.
Why do you always agree with the people we interview and not me? We've had this conversation prior to
We're
last
all
week.
younger than you, and it was you and your people that like destroyed this country, Sam.
My people.
No, I'm just joking. But there is that consensus, I think, amongst Gen Z and millennials that are like, why did you do this to us?
No, I do fault my generation and your generation too for failing the young generation like Reagan.
You and I are like 50 years apart. You're like turning 60 or something.
Oh my Lord, not even close. So Reagan, I want you to understand the disrespect that some of our guests have. But I want to come back to this. The power that Trump reflects is very different than perhaps the power that, let's say, the Biden represents. What is the key difference in that? Either one of you? Curious.
The key difference in that is white supremacy.
What do you mean by that?
So they're both leaders. The difference is, and so I met Joe Biden and heard him speak way before he ever, when he was vice president under the Obama administration, right? So the way that they speak to people, the way that they portray themselves, their executive presence, it's all very different, right? Trump is not only a positional leader in this country, he's also a leader of white supremacists. He speaks to his base in terms of like, you know, we need to basically, what he's basically saying is like, we need to take away power from people of color. And we need to make sure that they don't get power and they don't have rights and freedoms in this country. I mean, that's he says it in many different ways, right? But that's his overarching message. The way that Biden talks to his people is very different. You know, even some of the things that you hear, like Biden is more of a leader that I would say is more of a behind the scenes leader. He's like the person, and I think this is true under the Obama administration, like he does things and you don't know like the things that he does, but it shifts the country forward. You know, when he talks to you, he seems like a regular man in the room. And that was one of the reasons why people we're a little hesitant about him becoming the Democratic candidate is because when he shows up in a room, you might not notice him because he's like a normal person. Whereas Trump walks in with his, I'm here, you know, like I'm orange, whatever, right? Like he's got this whole like persona, and he makes it known that he's a leader. That's kind of the difference.
It's not just position of power. What you're talking is authoritative power, in one which he needs to have control of the media, control of the people, control of how he is perceived. And therefore, it's a very different kind of power than Biden, which is influential. And I want you to, what you're describing is influential power when it regards to Biden. And who could sort of describe to me what influential power is and how that's different from authoritative power?
I think they both have influential power.
But what's the difference? No, one is to control, the other one is to have influence over someone.
How are you defining influential power?
That's what I'm asking you. When I think of influential power, it's not for me to control what you think and how you live your life. Okay? Influence is sort of through my example, through what I say, maybe do, you look and you have the decision to, the person who is being influenced has the decision whether to accept or not, whether what I say is good or bad. What I find extremely interesting is with authoritative power is that somehow, even if people don't listen to you, whether it be by conspiracy, lies, something out there, you try to control what they think. Influence, not so much. They're not interested in the result. They're interested in the initial stages of talking with someone. That's what I think of influential power.
So I think influential power is basically like you use your power that you know you have in order to persuade and influence others. So I would argue that Trump has influential power over white supremacists and over his followers. I don't think he has influential power over, you know, the Biden people, the Biden supporters. Because you have to realize, right, like over 70 million Americans voted for Trump. He somehow influenced 70 million people. He uses authoritative power to control the 75 or whatever plus other million Americans who didn't agree with him.
Reagan, can you clarify for us what the difference between influential and authoritative power is? Is there a difference?
I think that there can be a difference in authoritative power versus influential power, because as an influential leader in a leadership position, you want a leader who can serve as kind of like a mentor that has the knowledge behind what they're doing and the experiences to then bring their experiences and put them on you, which then can help shape an event or affect that person, where authoritative power might directly cause the behavior of others or cause the events. So it's more of a forcefulness than influence.
Did you hear that, Jessica? And I love her differentiation. The reason why is an influencer uses their knowledge and shares it in the hopes that they might change the way they act or think. Authoritative is someone who forces it on another person.
Why can't you wield both at the same time?
Because authoritative power is interested in controlling ultimately how you think and how you act. Influencer allows the individual person to come to that knowledge or to even not to disagree with you. And this is where I think one of the reason why I think the difference is extremely important is one can be destructive. I think authoritative power can be extremely destructive because it is only wanting my objective to be fulfilled and to make sure that everyone follows what I think, or controlling the masses to do my bidding. Like right now, Trump is getting people to believe in, is it the stop the, what is that movement that he has going on to have people question the results of the election right now?
Yes.
Huh?
Yeah, I know what you're talking about, Sam. I think you're talking about the article that you sent me that I disagreed with.
Why do you disagree with that article?
Because I think that it's too simplistic. I think it's way too simplistic. I think the article that you sent me makes sense if you're looking at developing great managers. If you're looking at developing managers in a company, executives, directors, right? I think it's different when you're talking about making social impact and when you're talking about racial equity. So here, let me give you an example, right? If we were to take that article and apply it to a company that's run by white people, where everyone in the leadership positions are white, right? So as a person of color coming in, would I want a director who's white mentoring me? Maybe not. What kind of influence would they be able to have over me, not understanding my lived experiences and my struggles to operate in a white organization, right? So I think that it's different in terms of like when you're talking about social change and larger issues. I think it's different than when you're like within a small company talking about influence. Because like even if you look at the term influencer, right, on social media, like it's like it could be a negative or a positive thing. You have lots of influencers on social media.
Are you saying that I cannot mentor Reagan because I'm Korean American and she's white?
No, I'm not, because you're Korean American and she's white.
Are you saying I cannot be a mentor? I can be a mentor.
You can be a mentor to anyone, right? But what I'm saying is that the way that this country is run, largely in corporate America as well as in nonprofits, right? And the struggle that our country has had over racial equity this year, right? Look at all the issues and the movements that are happening because of George Floyd, right? We have a
Yes.
lot of people of color in nonprofits and in companies that are struggling, that are very white. Because their companies and nonprofits adhere to, like a white controlled leadership. And so for someone who's white, who doesn't understand their white privilege, has never questioned it, how would they be able to understand my experiences as a person of color? And if that's something that I'm experiencing, like microaggressions and stuff, like, and we hear it from people I work with every day, like they don't get it. They just don't get it. I'm struggling in the company because I'm proposing ideas or I'm wanting to work with this other community and they just don't get it, right? So that influence over me typically looks like, hey, you need to like assimilate into our company culture.
It's interesting. I think you're redefining what power is. It's beyond the influence. It's actually, power is not so much influencing, power is being more aware of other people's experiences. And so basically it's,
I think it's part of it. And I think everyone has power.
Well, I do agree, but I don't know. My question is, how would you define power within the nonprofit sector? That's what you're thinking of. In other words, because the way you're saying power is, I think of power from me outwards, authoritative influence outwards. What you're describing power is me being influenced by others. And so therefore, when I'm influenced by others, I'm more effective in terms of how I could lead them. Is that clear to you, Reagan? Because Jessica looks extremely confused.
You just threw a lot of words at me.
No, but the way I'm thinking power is to go from the self to outward.
And then back to you.
And then I get support from it. But the idea here is that I am influenced initially by others, and I take their ideas and I use their ideas and influence a larger group of people.
Reagan, what were you going to say? I saw you wanting to say something.
I think kind of saying what you were saying about the mentor, I agree with that. Also, that in the way of to mentor somebody, you have to have something in common with them. You have to be able to relate to them and share a idea or opinion about a certain something for it to be an effective mentorship.
How do you know you have something in common? Is by listening. It's not, in other words, it's knowing who you're mentoring, knowing the people you're working with. That awareness informs what and how I'm supposed to influence people. Is that right, Jessica and Reagan, what I'm hearing from you guys?
So I look at power in terms of like recognizing, and I think it's a lot of self-awareness, I think. So it's like recognizing the power you have, how your power has been cultivated, your privilege, your oppressions, and then deciding how you're going to use that power for good. For me, it's always about for good versus like I'm not into like all that bad, destructive power stuff. But I do think that it's like, how do you, and I do think influence is part of it, right? But I think it's also being aware of that. I think that like people who are great leaders know the power that they have, sit uncomfortably with it at times, many times, and are aware of how they use it and make it a part of their purpose to share it.
Share the power?
Yeah.
Oh my Lord, you and Miriam are the same.
That. I think sharing power is really important.
I come from North Korea, so I
Yeah, but that's
I'm just kidding. I'm not in North Korea, but
I think sharing power is really important.
Reagan, any final thoughts on what Jessica is saying?
I guess listen more to the others that you're trying to influence and speaking your own opinion and trying to solve the problems before you hear the whole picture, before you have the big picture already put together. You know what you're dealing with in terms of power and influence. I think
Well, I guess there's, it's interesting. I'm struggling with a clear definition of power now after this conversation. That I have to think, Jessica, because she likes to confuse me. I think one of the things that I need to figure out is this. If I do have power.
And you do.
The question is, to be effective, what is the best way to wield it and to what end? But that doesn't give me a definition of what power is. It gives me in terms of how to use it, but it doesn't help me figure out what definition of power I'm working with. And that's the part that I'm finding difficulty with this conversation, is trying to figure out. Because if you look at the kinds of power, they talk about authoritative relational influence, or they try to categorize all the different kinds of power that one person could have. But I don't think, like you said, Jessica, it can be clearly differentiated. If it isn't, how can we use it if we can't even define it? And that's my problem right there. If we don't even know what it is, how do I know I have it? And how am I supposed to use it? And that's the part that I'm not clear about, Jessica.
Why are you so stuck on having only one definition of power?
No, I'm the different kinds of power. I'm not saying there should be one definition. It's like, what kind of power are we talking about when we talk about activism? What kind of power are we talking about when we talk about running an organization, which is very distinct? And so that's what I'm talking about. Is there a way to define the different kinds of power, or is there one type of power?
I think it's different powers. It's definitely different powers
Okay.
that you're using and wielding, right? So like as an executive director, there are times I'll go into coalitions and I am using my positional power in order to be in that seat at the table, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But when in terms of activism, it's different kind, because it's more democratic in the sense that it's not your voice, but you being part of other people's voices. And that together will make a movement.
I wouldn't say it's necessarily democratic. That's a conversation for you to think about at another time.
Okay.
Because I think that decision making can happen in a lot of different like vacuums, right? And I don't think that the way that we think of democracy in America is the way that it's originally intended to be.
Well, remember, we're a republic, not a democratic country. In a sense, we have people representing us. So no, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about in terms of in the true form of the word democratic, of the people. Yeah, not of the republic. No, that would be a difference. All right. Thank you both for being part of this conversation. And looking forward to the next conversation with Reagan.